Hey everybody, I'm Deborah Richmond. We're going to talk about big stitch quilting today, and we're going to talk about methods for big stitch quilting that you involve very little marking. Sometimes marking is something that kind of trips people up as far as tools to use and things like that. First I'm going to show you what I love using patterns that involve very little marking, and I can just skip that step. Big stitch quilting is wonderful for quilting your quilts because it gives you a nice alternative to either machine quilting it, having it machine quilted, or hand quilting it with fine stitching. Big stitch gives you a way to do some hand stitching on it, but this is non-fussy. This is not fussy at all. It's big stitch for a reason. You use nice big stitches. It's really foolproof. It's easy to do, it's fast, and I think you're going to like it. So let's talk about first supplies. Now the supplies you're going to need to stitch a quilt. The quilt behind me has been stitched, and I'm just going to show you. We've got running stitches just up and down the quilt. Very, very simple.
So first let's talk about supplies. These are the things that you're going to need in order to stitch with your big stitch quilting. First let's talk about what type of floss you need. This is regular 6-strand floss. You can use that, or this is a pearl cotton. This happens to be a number 8. 8 is really nice because it fits really well into the needles that we'll be using. And also, if you're going to use the 6-strand, I like to go 3 or 4 strands because this is the floss that you can separate into different numbers of strands, so you can find what's comfortable for you. Next, let's talk about the needles. Now this is a pack of big stitch quilt pack needles, and I've pulled out my first needle. This, I find, these are really nice because they have a nice sharp point. Sometimes if you use a darning needle, you can do that, but the end of it sometimes is not that sharp. We need something that's going to pierce through all 3 layers of our quilt very easily. And so these needles are designed specifically for that. They're very sharp on the end, and they have an eye that is bigger than a quilting needle, so that we can actually get this larger thread through it.
Next, you're going to need a good thimble. Now this is a leather thimble, and this is my favorite. I'm going to give you information below on how to get a hold of this particular thimble, but I like it because it's leather and it's thick and it's small enough so that I still get lots of good control when I'm using it for pushing the needle through the fabrics.
The next thing is some marking masking tape, and I'm going to show you how we're going to use this. This one is a quilting masking tape that is just like regular size masking tape, but it's very thin, 1/4 of an inch. Same thing with this one, it's a 1/4 of an inch, but this particular tape is called glow line tape, and it comes in a pack of 3 different colors. This particular tape I like because it doesn't have the as much of the adhesive on the backing. In fact, this one won't leave any adhesive at all. Now when I'm marking with this, and I'll show you a little bit later, I don't really worry about that because I'm not going to leave the tape on for very long on the fabric, so I've never had any problem with the masking. You just make sure that when you're through, if you're putting it down for a while, you just take the tape off and you'll put it back when you start quilting again the next time. And then last, you're going to need some either little scissors or snips. These are called SnipEze. These are my favorite because they're very easy to pick up for snipping threads. And I love to have these in all of my bags and all of my places where I love to quilt because it's just nice to very easily grab them. These have like a bit of a spring to them, and so it's just, they're always open, grab them, snip, and they're always back open again, ready for you the next time. You also may need a quilting hoop. And now this is one that I'm using right now. I like this particular size and I like this particular shape. I use round ones as well. I don't go real big. I like it to be just very comfortable in my lap because I do all of my quilting in my lap. And so a quilter's hoop is something you may use, but I'm also going to show you how you can do this without a hoop. So first let me show you a couple of ideas for the quilting designs that take very little marking. In fact, I used no marking for these, and I'll show you. This particular quilt is a scrap quilt that I did, and I wanted to try the big stitch quilting, and I also wanted to do something very fast. This is these are straight lines that go straight up the quilt, and row after row after row. Very simple design, very easy to do, and very fast. So all I'm doing is I'm starting at one end of a quilt, right at the edge is where I'll start, and then I'm starting to stitch and I'm going to stitch all the way up. Now this particular type of quilting I did not use a marking pen for at all. I eyed it, and I like to do that with the big stitch quilting because really the idea behind big stitch quilting is you want it to be a bit uneven, you want it to be a bit primitive looking, you get more of an artsy feel, and so that's why if I just eye it, I'm not real worried about super straight lines because this is more of a folk art look. So I would just kind of pick how far from the seam I want to go, and I'm just following this seam all the way up the quilt. Both sides, I go this side and that side. And then I would jump to the next row and I would sew same distance from the seam. Here's the seam right there. And so I didn't need any marking. Now you can use the tapes that I showed you for marking, and I'll show you. It's very simple. So here's the masking tape that I was talking about, and this you can get at most quilt shops. You can also, I'll tell you below where you can get a hold of it. So it's very sticky on one side. It's just like masking tape you use around the house. And so if I'm going to, let's say I'm going to add one more line down the middle of this, all I'm going to do is I'm going to place some tape, and I don't need a whole lot of it, right down the middle, get it exactly where I want it, and now I can start quilting right next to that tape all the way up the row. So for some people, if you want more of a guide than that seam is, the tape is the way to go. It gives you a nice straight line to follow. And again, this tape, you're going to use it for, you know, the hour or two that you're quilting each time you sit down, and then you're going to take it off so that it's not laying on your quilt. You don't want any of that adhesive to stick to that fabric and leave any residue. I've left on tape really quite a couple of days, but I would recommend, just to make sure that you don't get any residue, take it off when you're done quilting for the day. Now the other one is this neon tape, and it's very similar. The only difference with this one is that it is less sticky. So you can see I can still place it on my quilt and place it down. All I'm going to do is press that a little bit more than the other, and now that stays on. Now it's a very delicate tape, and for using on fabric, like I said, it's not very sticky, but it gives you enough of a line as you're going that will help you kind of keep that guide going, that straight line. Now I'm going to show you another idea for designing your quilting with very little marking. This is another utility quilt, scrap quilt that I put together, and I decided on this one that I was going to, here's your main block, and in each block I decided I'm going to use a V of stitching here and a V of stitching here all the way around the block. See there? Same thing on here and this side. So what that gives me is the V's are radiating out from this block, but you'll see as you move to the next block, the V for this block, what you end up with is these nice squares all the way around. It just is a nice, easy pattern to follow. Again, I just eyed it. Each time I started quilting, I'd start right at the middle of this half square triangle, middle of this seam here, and stitch up to the middle of this seam here, and then start here and move up. Very simple. Again, you can use the masking tapes, or you can do this simply by eyeing it. So now let's talk about a hoop versus no hoop. Now I do a lot of my quilting, big stitch and regular hand quilting, in a hoop. However, I am liking the non-hoop type of quilting particularly for the quilt that I showed you that had the long lines that go up and down the quilt. The reason for that is because as I'm sewing long lines, I would have to move my quilt all the time. Like every few minutes I'm moving my quilt. But if I can just go ahead and not use a hoop for those long straight lines, this is ideal. And I find that I'm starting, you get used to it. I've always used a hoop, but I'm really starting to get used to the non-hoop, and I like it. So it's really very simple. You're going to be starting your thread. I'm going to show you how to start a thread. This is our pearl cotton loaded in my needle. I'm going to go ahead and from the top, I'm going to go ahead and put this right into between the two fabrics. I'm just going to do one large stitch just to get us started. I want to get that thread in here. And I'm going to leave just a little bit of a tail just so I can hang on to it when I get started. Later I'm going to cut this and snip this off, but I'm going to go back stitch first. My first stitch is going to be back. All right. I've taken a pretty small stitch. Now from here on, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do big stitch. Now you can see this fabric has lines running through it, so I'm going to just follow this line, and it goes just like this. I like to put the thimble on my thumb if I'm going to go this direction, and I'm going to make nice big stitches. Now when I'm not using a hoop, what's nice is you put your needle through all three, and now I can keep pushing by bunching up the fabric. I can keep pushing a lot of stitches onto this needle before I pull it through. That's really very fun, and that makes this go even faster. So I'll show you again. I'm just simply putting my needle down all through all three. My hand is underneath it, pushing that needle back up. I'm going to take nice big stitches. I have to sometimes remind myself, don't do small stitches, go ahead and do big, because that's where you get this nice pop of color that comes through the quilt. Now I'm going to show you how to end a thread, and this is the same whether you're using a hoop or not using a hoop. I'm going to take my needle, and what I'm going to be doing is threading this back through the stitches to kind of anchor it in there. So I'm going to take one stitch, and I'm going to be moving my needle. What I'm doing is I'm moving my needle between this stitch and that stitch and this stitch, just by kind of moving my fabric around so that it is now twined in there like this. So I'll show you again. I'm going to take this, and I want to twine in between the layers. I want it to go between these stitches. So I'm going to put my needle in between the layers. I'm not going all the way through the back. I'm in the middle. And I can feel my needle is here, and I'm going to turn it so my needle is here. Do you see it? But I'm going to put it back in the middle. I don't want to see this stitch on top. And one more, and I'm going to come out right here. So my thread is around here, here, and here. When I pull this through, you don't see it because it's in between layers. You don't see it on the back because it's in between layers as well. And then all you're going to do is when you're done with that, because it is nicely laid in there and entwined between the stitches, you snip it off. Same thing with that end that you started with. You go ahead and snip that off, and you have a nice row of stitches. So now I'm going to show you with the hoop. Very, very similar. What I've done this time is I have used my embroidery floss, and I'm using 3 strands at a time. So I've separated, so I have 3 strands loaded into my needle. I'm going to go ahead and I put my hand underneath the quilt, and I'm going to start by going all the way through all layers so that I can feel this needle underneath, and my hand is like this, and I'm pushing it through, feeling it, and then I push it back up again. So down, and I push it back up again. Now I'm going to go ahead and take a couple stitches. I'm going to use my thimble to push because it takes a little bit of muscle, and I'm going to leave, this time I'm going to leave quite a bit of tail here because I'm going to show you how you can anchor that tail after the fact. So now I like to turn my hoop because I'm going to push in this direction with my thumb, so that's why I like the hoop in this direction for that. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take 1, 2, at most I'm going to take like 3 stitches with this one. And that's because the length of my needle, that's how many comfortably go in. Now again, you don't have to be real small stitches, and they don't have to be real even. That really is what gives this nice folk art look, and it makes it just very carefree. Now again, if I want to end this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to serpentine that thread through the needles, through the stitches, and cut it off. I can also do the same thing now with this end. If I leave enough end, I can now rethread this and then go ahead and push it through those threads like that, pull it back out, and then I'll clip it off. Now if I don't want to do that to the end, I often do not. I often will start from a distance, give it a good 1/2 inch, and then start the stitching and simply cut off the thread like I showed you with the first example. But if that makes you nervous to have it just snipped off without anchoring it between the stitches, go ahead and leave enough tail when you start so that you can then thread those through the stitches when you finish.
So just a couple of tips. If you're going to start big stitch quilting and you haven't done it before, I recommend that you start with either a baby quilt, a wall hanging, or a small quilt. And I also recommend you start with something that is more of a utility quilt, something that doesn't need to have fine handwork. Just because you want to start with something, get used to the stitching, get used to how you're going to handle the quilt and the fabric as you go. Then once you've done one small quilt, you'll be very confident with big stitch quilting. You'll be able to use it on much larger quilts. Now the only thing that you kind of need to get used to if you're going to use it without a hoop, if you're going to stitch without a hoop, is just how you handle the whole quilt. For instance, as I quilted through the middle of this quilt, I then had to put my hand, bunch up most of the quilt on my arm, and then quilt through. So it's just a matter of figuring out how you're manipulating the quilt as you are working on it. Same thing with a hoop. I feel like a hoop is a little bit easier, but that's because I've always used a hoop. But you'll have the rest of the quilt here. You just get your hand under it. All the quilt is here, and then you're quilting right here in the hoop. So there's a lot of reasons to try big stitch quilting. One is it's a fast, easy way to finish your quilt. It's also inexpensive. It's a way for you to use up some of those embroidery flosses you may have built up over the years. I know it has been for me. I've really brought down that big stash of threads by using it with big stitch quilting. And the other reason is if you like the more folk art look of big stitch quilting, there are certain quilts that really adds to it. I love it on scrap quilts. I think it's fantastic because you can use all the different colors of thread you want and they all look good. So go ahead and try some big stitch quilting. Thanks for joining me.
And be sure to subscribe to our channel. You can do so here by clicking the subscribe button. That way you'll find out about new videos as they become available.